First of all, thanks to Ken and everyone who's responsible for putting on this conference. For me, it's always a great pleasure to come back to Princeton. I spent 2 of the happiest years of my life at Princeton. I'm always inclined to say that was at the beginning of the Anthropocene, but actually, in truth, it was the beginning of the millennium, which sounds almost as long ago. And I also can't help but say, although I think this will mean something to a few people in the room, but probably not to most of you, that I think this is the 3rd talk that I've given in this room. And the first talk I gave in this room is quite welded into my memory because it involved an extremely heated and at least from my point of view, instructive discussion with the wonderful late Princeton economist David Bradford. And so it's hard for me to actually be present in this room without thinking of David in those exchanges, who was very important in the creation of environmental activity around Princeton. So anyway, I'm sure that David would disapprove of everything I'm going to say anyway. So let's see. So I guess the other thing that I want to say is, and maybe this is good news since I'm all that stands between you and lunch, is that I am a fairly literal-minded guy, and so I took my charge in a very straightforward way is to really just talk about what we might mean by environmental ethics and about the field of environmental ethics. And to give you a kind of overview and to raise some questions and to speculate on some answers. In a way, it's a very sort of institutional talk. It's not very heady, and it isn't particularly centered on my own research, but it's sort of reflections on a field that I've had something to do with now for a long time. Okay, now when you ask the question, does environmental ethics have a future? In one sense, the answer is obviously true, because there's a kind of trivial sense of the term ethics, in which there's an ethics about sort of everything that we touch or we deal with. There's an ethics of, basketball. There's an ethics of woodworking. It has to do with the norms that prevail with respect to any area in which we're involved. So that's not what I'm going to talk about, right? So in some sense, environmental ethics has a future because we will have some ethic about the environment, even if it's just an ethic of destruction, right? What I'm going to be interested in, and the 3 questions that I'm going to try to address are, first of all, I want to say something about the centrality of ethics in the American environmental movement, in the history of the American environmental movement. I think it's important to kind of, even in a sort of impressionistic way, to try to recover some of that history and to understand how important a kind of set of moral and ethical commitments, and not necessarily the same ones, but have been intrinsic to the American environmental movement. And secondly, I want to talk a little about the question of whether the current environmental crisis requires some kind of new ethic, which was a very important question in creating the field of environmental ethics in the 1970s and 80s. And then finally, this will strike some of you as a little bit of inside baseball, but I want to talk a little about the viability of environmental ethics as an academic field, because at the end of the day, if environmental humanities is to be a going project, it's going to be embedded in American universities, which after all are big businesses, right? And important and powerful institutions. And so you can't really avoid the question of how these kinds of activities are doing in terms of their institutional homes and frameworks. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Okay, so first, to remind myself, the centrality of ethics in the environmental movement. Okay, this very ugly man, Henry David Thoreau, self-confessedly ugly, and all the contemporary reports attest to the wisdom of his own remarks. This is about the nicest picture I could find of Thoreau, who lived from 1817 to 1862. And it's a bit arbitrary where one kind of begins to say that American environmentalism comes. I'm just going to start with Thoreau, and then I'm going to give you somebody from sort of each succeeding generation until we get to the present, just as meant to be samples. But I think it's important to remember 2 things about Thoreau, in the sense of a reminder. One is what a serious moralist he was in the first place. I mean, Thoreau wasn't just the guy who liked to go tripping around the woods around Walden Pond. This was a highly principled, morally committed person across a whole range of issues. And secondly, he was someone who was deeply influenced by the prevailing philosophical currents of his time. So, so just again, as a way of reminder, Thoreau is the author of Civil Disobedience, which was a text which was hugely influential, famously on Martin Luther King, and through Martin Luther King to a lot of subsequent contemporary social movements. Civil disobedience was a moral commitment for Thoreau. Not only was he an abolitionist with respect to slavery, but he was an articulate and pretty unconditional defender of John Brown and John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. And at the time, even among respectable abolitionists, John Brown was considered to be something of a terrorist, and indeed, in some ways, something of an embarrassment to the cause of abolition. Thoreau was opposed to the Mexican War, which he saw as an imperial adventure. He was opposed to corporal punishment in schools, which was an extremely, he was a school teacher for a while and didn't work out very well, partially because he didn't want to beat his students. This was a very unpopular view at the time. He had weird views about animals, as he tended to have fairly weird and cranky views about everything, but there's no doubt that animals were for him creatures to be taken with a great degree of moral seriousness and worthy of respect. Again, famously, he emphasized a simplicity in lifestyle. And there's kind of a broader view in Thoreau's writings that in some sense our fundamental ethical obligation is a kind of clarity of perception, to see the world aright for what it is and how it presents it to be. And for Thoreau, this wasn't just good advice about how to experience the world. This was really the fundamental moral obligation of being a human being. And then finally, I think it's important to point out how strongly influenced he was by New England transcendentalism, which was sort of the dominant American philosophy of the 19th century. He was quite influenced by Emerson. He lived in Emerson's house for a while as a handyman and tutor to his children. And a recent book on Thoreau by Phil Cafaro places him as, quote, squarely in the virtue ethics tradition. So, that's Thoreau. Now, this old hairy guy, probably most of you will recognize as John Muir, who essentially represents the next generation. Muir is essentially a generation older than Thoreau, living from 1838 to 1914. And I'm not going to say a lot about Muir because I think Muir is pretty familiar to us as the founder of the Sierra Club and so on. But what's distinctive of Muir is really the focus on preservationism, that nature should be preserved, and the sort of grounds that he gives for preservation aren't just the kind of conservationist grounds, so I'll have more of it around later to use to satisfy human needs, but really two things. One is he identified these what you might call these what we like to call these days non-consumptive uses of nature. He emphasized the spiritual and aesthetic value of nature, right, of just the experience of nature and not simply the use of nature to satisfy material needs. But he also emphasized the intrinsic value of nature, the idea that nature is valuable in its own right, independent of any human uses of nature, even these non-consumptive spiritual and aesthetic ones. And there are so many wonderful quotations in Muir that would be easy to do a talk that's just a reading of Muir. But I like this particular quotation because I think it brings out how, for Muir, both of these ways of valuing nature are really fused, both the idea of the intrinsic value of nature and of its spiritual and aesthetic value. And so since I'm a very boring PowerPoint user, I will now, and because I love these quotes, I will simply read the quote. We all flow from one fountain soul. All our expressions of one love, kind of sounds like Bob Marley there, God does not appear and flow out, only from the narrow chinks and round-bored wells here and there in favored races and places. But he flows in grand, undivided currents, shoreless and boundless over creeds and forms and all kinds of civilizations and peoples and beasts, saturating all and fountainizing all. So it's kind of just this picture of kind of the effusiveness of value over all of God's creation, with there being no particular privilege that's attached to humanity or any of its projects, or any particular part of humanity over anything else. Now, the generation after Muir, I think a characteristic figure is Gifford Pinchot, who kind of started out as an ally of Muir. They famously broke over the Hetch Hetchy Dam project in Yosemite. But Gifford Pinchot is an interesting character. He was the founder of what was then the Yale School of Forestry, which has now hippified itself into the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. It's kind of a mark of the times. And when you read a lot of standard histories of environmentalism, you often get this kind of contrast between sort of Muir the moralist and Pinchot, this kind of sober managerial type, which it's not that view is false. It is important to recognize that Pinchot's managerialism was itself founded on an ethic. This isn't sort of a kind of ethical view of the environment against a view that's not ethical. It's an alternative ethical view of the environment. And indeed, Pinchot actually coined the phrase conservation ethics, and in his own way had a quite committed set of moral beliefs, not just about the environment, but really about everything. He was a progressive Republican, an ally of Theodore Roosevelt. He liked to quote this phrase from W.J. McGee. W.J. McGee's an interesting historical footnote, which I will refrain from going there at this point. But McGee had this wonderful phrase, the greatest good for the greatest number for the longest time. So you sort of get the classic utilitarian formulation from Bentham or Mill, although neither McGee nor Pinchot actually ever cite Bentham or Mill, which is kind of interesting. It might show you how much these utilitarian ideas were in the air, I don't know. They were, especially McGee was kind of a crazy autodidact anyway. But what's kind of interesting about this is you get the greatest good for the greatest number, but you get it expanded in time for the longest time. This is a new dimension, arguably kind of implicit in Bentham and Mill. But also Pinchot, the importance of scientific management was for him an ethical commitment, and also this idea of equity. He famously, he was the first head of the U.S. Forest Service. He was a very, very strong advocate of the forests being under public ownership as opposed to being turned over to private interests. And that's because of a kind of egalitarian view that he had, that the forests belonged to and should be accessible to all the people. Now, the phrase that I want to focus on when I talk about the next figure is this wonderful quotation from Pinchot. Pinchot wrote a memoir at the end of his life. He had a really interesting life. He was governor of Pennsylvania, was a United States senator, was always winning and losing political battles. You can kind of tell from the picture, right? This is no John Muir, right? This is a guy who's part of the establishment, right? But I love this phrase from his memoir. There are just two things on this material earth, people and natural resources, okay? It's a really clear statement of a particular way of looking at the world. And in a way, the figure from the next generation who I want to talk about, Aldo Leopold, I think you can sort of interpret Leopold as beginning, the early Leopold, who, after all, was a student at the Yale School of Forestry. And although I'm not sure, I haven't really checked this out, but may well have been a student of Pinchot's there, because Pinchot was teaching when Leopold was a student. And Leopold actually begins with this kind of the conservation ethic of Pinchot. One thing we sometimes forget about Leopold is that he was really the founder of the applied science of wildlife management in the United States. And he wanted to do for wildlife what Pinchot did for trees, right? Pinchot was essentially giving you this kind of theoretical justification for things like maximum sustained yields of forests. Leopold started off wanting to do that for gain. He wrote the first wildlife management textbook in the 30s. But in a way, his whole career, his whole life then, it moves away from this dualism that Pinchot had, which is that there's people and there's resources. And what Leopold really does is he explodes both of those categories. And that's really the sort of essence of the land ethic. So, so the first thing that happens with the land ethic, is it a quote here? Yes. The land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to plain member and citizen of it. So it's no longer that humans are privileged as sort of one end of this binary or dichotomy. No, humans are now demoted to just being citizens of the land community, like everything else in the land community. But the other side of that is the rest of the land community, isn't just a bunch of resources then for humanity. The rest of the land community are themselves fellow citizens of the land community. So, the way that I would understand Leopold is of this sort of voyage that begins with Pinchot and ends with this sort of destruction, this kind of deconstruction of the Pinchot view. Now, the other thing I want to point out about Leopold, too, is again, he was a very self-conscious moralist. You don't have to dig very deep to find an ethic in these guys. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the. Now, you can raise all kinds of issues with this formulation, with this theory of value, if you will, but he's telling you really what's right and wrong, what's good and bad. He's not shrinking from this. There's no sort of hiding behind some idea of neutrality here at all. This is really front and center. The other thing I think is kind of interesting about Leopold, which reminds me of what Mr. Baer was saying earlier, is Leopold was also interested in the whole idea of how moral change happens. Not just, here's the land ethic. He was interested in how we as individuals and we as a society could come to implement and act on the land ethic. And so again, with the opening remarks today, I was kind of struck by this quotation from Leopold: "No important change in ethics was ever accomplished without an internal change in our intellectual emphasis, loyalties, affections, and convictions." Well, that sounds an awful lot like you could rewrite this as no important change in ethics was ever accomplished without the environmental humanities, if you will. That's the stuff that he's talking about. It's not that, we simply come to learn new facts about the world and everything changes, but this is much more an internal change in a whole outlook. Well, that didn't work. Oh yeah, got to push the right button. So the next generation was racial Carson, and I mean these generational things literally. All these people are 20 to 25 years apart from each other in birth dates, I think it's almost enough said about racial Carson. Sorry, this slide doesn't, I guess you can see it fairly clearly. This is an interesting slide. Does anybody have any guess when this image, how long ago this image was produced? So it says ethics in the environmental movement. When do you think that image comes from? What? When the book came out?
64.
Yeah. Good guess, but actually last week. No. This is really striking to me. There is in San Diego something called an ethics consortium, which is composed of people from UC San Diego State, and USD, and they have an essay contest for undergraduates. So you're an undergraduate, you write these essays, you submit them, you can make a little bit of money. And so they decided for their topic this year, and sometimes it's stuff like geoengineering or. Not geoengineering, I'm just too stuck in climate mode, But it can be any topic in ethics. It isn't necessarily anything about the environment, just some topic in ethics. So this year's essay prize is for an essay on ethics in the environmental movement. Oh, that's interesting. So they're doing ethics in the environmental movement. But what do they choose as the image? Racial Carson, okay? I think that shows you how deeply entrenched the idea of racial Carson as a moralist, as an environmental ethicist, really is in at least much of our culture. And for good reason. I mean, this is a fairly characteristic passage from the end of Silent Spring. I won't read it all out. The control of nature is a phrase conceived of arrogance, a moral term, born of the Neanderthal age of biology and philosophy, et cetera, et cetera. So, again, someone not shrinking from expressing an ethic. Now, there are a couple of other features about Silent Spring and about Rachel Carson that I think are not sufficiently noted. The first one is I love running a quiz show and having Rob ask, try to answer the questions. This is good. But I'll refrain from doing.
Why should I?
Yeah, exactly. I know. No, I won't do it again. But sometimes I ask people who obviously know Silent Spring backward and forward who the book was dedicated to. I won't ask you that. It was dedicated to Albert Schweitzer, which is an extremely interesting dedication. Albert Schweitzer, organist, theologian, medical missionary, winner of the 1952 Nobel Peace Prize, but very well known, especially at the time that Carson was writing, for this idea which was called an ethic of reverence for life. And again, you can argue about the ethic and so on, but that's what Schweitzer was mainly known for at the time Carson was writing, was as the advocate of an ethic of reverence for life. So if you had any question, really, about what was underpinning the attitude of Silent Spring, it was given to you by the dedication. Now, the other thing that's interesting is, shortly after the publication of Silent Spring, she wrote the foreword to a book by Ruth Harrison called Animal Machines, which is a book that most of us don't remember at all. But this was really the first big expose of factory farming. So Ruth Harrison's book, Animal Machines, was about the horrors of factory farming. And so it was a kind of foundational book for what later became the animal liberation movement, Peter Singer, animal liberation 10 years later, et cetera, et cetera. Now, again, interestingly, this is a poster for a conference that's happening next week in Oxford, which brings together Rachel Carson and Ruth Harrison 50 years later, and even more interestingly, I think, who's sponsoring this conference. It's not philosophy or literature, it's the zoology department at Oxford that's putting on this conference. All right, so the last figure who I want to talk about in this kind of Cook's tour of American environmentalism and the centrality of a kind of ethical compass is an extremely influential paper by Lynn White Jr., who was essentially a medieval historian, called The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. It's also interesting that this paper began as a lecture to the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, was published in Science magazine. With White, you essentially get the turn towards religion as well. And basically what White says is what we do about ecology depends on our ideas of the man-nature relationship. More science and more technology are not going to get us out of the present ecological crisis until we find a new religion or rethink our old one. Now, this paper, more than anything, really sort of set off the activity that led to the formation of the field of environmental ethics. And in philosophy, it really gets its first clear expression in academic philosophy in a paper by an Australian philosopher named Richard Routley, who later changed his name to Sylvan, became Richard Sylvan. And this paper, Is There a Need for a New and Environmental Ethic, was published in 1973 in the Proceedings of a World Congress of Philosophy. And actually, Routley in this paper doesn't actually answer the question. He sort of leans in the direction of yes, maybe, but he runs a series of thought experiments that have been extremely influential in the field, although in many different forms and often not without attribution to Routley. But these are a series of thought experiments that he calls last man examples, and he asks us to imagine cases in which you're the last man, as he puts it, and where there is a last man. And what the last man is going to do is to, destroy all the cathedrals and rock formations and trees and forests and basically flatten out the planet, et cetera, et cetera. And the question is, would it be wrong for the last man to do that, right? And if essentially you have an ethic that thinks, the way it's supposed to go anyway, it's very complicated, is if you have this the sort of ethic that thinks that all value in some sense depends on human valuers, then it's hard to see what's wrong with what the last man does. But yet many of us have the intuitive response, there's something wrong with this. And the question then is how to explain that. So this really then set up the field of environmental ethics in its formative years in the 70s and 80s as really being about this question of whether there's a new environmental ethic. And it almost became implied that the very existence of the field of environmental ethics depended on an affirmative answer to this question. After all, what could be the rationale of this new field if it weren't the exploration and development and articulation of a new ethic in response to the environmental crisis? So essentially, there were two ideas put forward about what this new ethic was supposed to be that was associated with the environment. By the way, I should also say there's a subtext here. The subtext is whatever this new environmental ethic is, it's supposed to kill every other ethic, in the sense that the new environmental ethic is supposed to be what provides the moral high ground, so that when somebody says, but I could make a lot of money, filling this wetland, the answer is, but that would be inconsistent with this ethic, which trumps everything else. So it was supposed to actually play this kind of rhetorical role, if you will. So the two candidates for the new environmental ethic, one coming fairly directly out of the questions Routley was asking, was that environmental values are mind-independent values. They're just values that exist independent of human beings. We have a lot of values that we create, et cetera, but environmental values transcend that in some sense. And that's a view that's associated most strongly with Holmes Ralston, a philosopher at Colorado State University. The other view, which is associated with Baird Callicutt, was, what we learned from the environmental crisis is that there are things that are actually, that there is value that attaches to ecological wholes and not just individuals. So ecosystems, species, et cetera, have values that transcend the values of individuals. Now, there's all kinds of arguments and issues that can be raised about these claims that I'm really happy to talk about in discussion. But the point I want to make is that what's really happened is that the sort of case for these kinds of values has not really stood up very well, at least in the terms in which they were put forward. And so there's kind of a rough current consensus, which is roughly that, look, you can give strong environmental arguments that don't require the metaphysical and normative baggage of mind independence and holism. That is, you can make strong cases for protecting the environment that don't depend on these new values, but there isn't going to be any special kind of value that environmentalists can appeal to that are going to make their opponents drop dead. So there's no way around dealing with the plurality of values and the trench warfare of figuring out how we manage to get through this world with the multiple sets of values that we have that often come into conflict. Okay. So that actually then left the field of environmental ethics as an institutional field with a pretty severe challenge. Because after all, if the environmental crisis doesn't require a new ethic, then what's the point of this field, which after all was founded kind of in the wake of the Lynn White article and so on as being about the search for a new environmental ethic? Why then do we have this field of environmental ethics? And in addition, the field of environmental ethics suffers from a double curse. The first is that it's new, and as we know in universities, there tend to be this prejudice that if this field of investigation or this area of thought had anything to it, why isn't there already an existing department that does that, that is funded by some government agency, right? So there's a kind of bias against the new that is involved in universities, partially because universities rightly have a conservatory function as well as a function of dealing with new issues and new problems. Sometimes it gets out of balance. But then also there's, in most academic disciplines, certainly in philosophy, there's a bias against anything that's viewed as applied, right, as opposed to the theoretical and abstract. Now, it's an interesting question, I think, as to whether environmental ethics is really an applied area or whether it represents a kind of cross-cutting way of looking at a broad domain. In other words, just to bring it into philosophy, there's an interesting question as to whether environmental ethics or philosophy, and these terms are loaded, is just a branch of ethics, an applied branch of ethics, or whether taking on board environmental concerns affects the way you look at the history of philosophy, epistemology, metaphysics, philosophy of science, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, as with most of these races, I have a horse in this race, as I do in most of the things I'm talking about. And in 1994, with one of my graduate students, we edited a pretty widely used reader that was called Reflecting on Nature, Readings in Environmental Philosophy. And years later, when we decided to do a second edition with another graduate student of mine, the image isn't very clear, which just came out, I think, this year, this ethics philosophy question seemed to be freighted for many readers, so we, of course, took the coward's way out and we changed the subtitle to Readings on Environmental Ethics and Philosophy. So have it as you will. I mean, if you want to see it as an applied area, it is. If you want to see it as a broad crosscut, you can see it as that. Okay, but there is a kind of institutional bottom line. The slow acceptance by philosophy departments and elite institutions of this field means that there's a lack of graduate training. It's hard. There are more graduate students who actually want to study in this field than are able to do so. And it also leads to kind of a failure of agreed standards of competence. So there is a lot of diversity in about what the field is like, what it's about, what counts as quality in the field, and so on and so forth. So there's a sense in which the enterprise that sort of started in the 70s, creating this new subfield, for various reasons has not fared very well, at least not in the way that many people thought that it would. Okay, and what this means then is that the academic field of environmental ethics is now, I think, at risk from being exiled or marginalized within philosophy, but then being lost in environmental studies, because environmental studies programs themselves are constructed in different ways. Some have a central place for the discussion of ethical issues, and some don't. Some simply see themselves as essentially as environmental science and policy programs. Okay, good. I'm wrapping up pretty quickly here. So now we're really in summary mode. So where are we then with respect to my three questions? I told Ken I would not only ask the questions, I would answer them. So this is the part where I answer the questions. Centrality of ethics in the American environmental movement, the question of whether the environmental crisis requires a new ethic, and the viability of environmental ethics as an academic field. Okay, first of all, I think if you look at the history of the American environmental movement, what we might call sort of moral and managerial approaches to environmental problems tend to ebb and flow, sometimes coming into conflict with each other, sometimes complementing each other, right? So what you got at the time of Muir and Pinchot, for example, was the kind of rise of the more managerial view. Muir was seen as kind of an isolated moralist, out of step with the times, et cetera, et cetera. Environmental questions were going to be seen as questions about what was sometimes called the gospel of efficiency. You know, we're going to be able to manage nature in ways that was all going to work out. We get to the post-World War II era, and we get Aldo Leopold, and we get Rachel Carson. We get the kind of re-injection of the kind of ethical dimension of environmental problems. I mean, so there's a sense in which I think there's kind of a healthy dynamic between these two approaches. But I also think that historically the trend across many issues, including environmental issues, is probably towards the increasing dominance of the managerial. And what tends to happen is when we get desperate about a problem, we start moralizing it. So it's kind of striking to me, if you look at climate politics, for example, is that sort of once it became sort of clear that that the guys in the suits, meeting at different COPs scattered around the world weren't going to solve this problem. Then you got people like Al Gore starting to talk about climate change is a moral issue. What does that mean? That means it's hopeless unless we can actually generate, the kind of popular and social movement around this kind of problem that moral language actually does tend to motivate. I mean, nobody goes in the streets and gets arrested in order to change, clause 4, Article 3, paragraph 2 of an international agreement. People get in the street and go to jail because they want to stop a pipeline or something like that, right? So it's an interesting dynamic, I think, between the moral and the managerial approaches. Okay. Now, on the second question, I actually do think that environmental problems, such as climate change, do require revisions in our morality. I actually have a book coming out on exactly this topic, which kind of elaborates something that I said in a paper in 1992. Today we face the possibility that the global environment may be destroyed, yet no one will be responsible. This is a new problem. So I think that kind of the first generation of environmental ethics sort of had it wrong as to where the question of the new ethic needed to be located. It's about responsibility rather than being sort of in theory of value. But nevertheless, I do think that our inherited ethical systems, which largely evolved in low technology, low density environments, essentially the sources of common sense morality, where the kind of paradigm moral case is, somebody taking something from somebody else, are not really geared up to deal with these massive collective action problems that involve powerful technologies where the contribution of individuals are negligible, but the consequences are and can be catastrophic. Okay, so I think the first generation of the field was right about that. And as for this question about the institutional role of environmental ethics, I think it's quite possible that rather than being in crisis, rather than that dark picture that I was giving you earlier, environmental ethics may simply be shape-shifting, because part of what's happened, at least in my years in academia, has been that the environmental dimensions of problems have increasingly become part of the sort of unspoken mainstream assumptions of many disciplines. So if you do politics, if you do sociology these days, whatever the discipline is, it won't be weird for somebody to be talking about an environmental issue or an environmental example or something of that sort in a way that it would have been weird a generation ago. So what you might be seeing happening with environmental ethics, I'm not endorsing this, but the possible failure of the field as a kind of independent subfield may in part be caused by the fact that the energy, the themes, and the topics are sort of being more widely diffused across a range of existing disciplines. Okay, so those are my answers to those three questions. But I do think it's important to recognize that if the shape-shifting is what's going on, it's going on against the background of what I think is a larger crisis in our universities and systems of knowledge production. And I'm only going to say a couple things about this. One is there is nobody in their right mind who thinks that the present system of university finance and increasing loss of access on the part of working class and middle class, not to mention poor people, have to American universities. Nobody I know who thinks that's a sustainable system. And by not sustainable, I mean collapsing much more quickly than many of the environmental goods that we're talking about. And secondly, if you look at American universities as investments that are made by the American people in education and knowledge production, I think it's very difficult to actually justify the allocation of resources. As I said earlier, universities have both this conservatory function to preserve culture, history, and heritage, but they also have this obligation to solve contemporary problems. And I think quite arguably, the investment is hugely biased in the direction of the conservatory function, partially because status quo always tends to benefit those who are already involved in the system, as opposed to the recognition of new problems in the attempts to try to solve them. But, as my old dog Ludwig used to say, these are topics for another day. Thank you for your attention.
So we are back on schedule. Thanks, Bill. Which means we do have time for questions. So,
Ludwig will answer the question. Henry?
In a sense, one of the problems that you raised asks the question of how does one balance personal values and personal how does one balance personal values and personal responsibilities against collective values and collective responsibilities. And it does strike me that that is a question that has a history in philosophy that goes all the way back to Plato, but is just not currently emphasized as much as individual values and responsibilities. And is there room for a new ethic being developed there, given the holism and mind independence don't seem to be working out?
Right. So one direction to go is certainly thinking of ourselves and our obligations as being sort of irreducibly community-driven.
yeah,
Oh,
the
sorry.
mic. Sorry.
I keep forgetting that I'm actually talking to people in Slovenia, so and they can't hear me when I'm away from the microphone. So one direction to go in is to think that we have obligations, say, not to emit greenhouse gases, that can't be reduced to individual obligations, but are obligations that we simply have as members of a community, right? They're obligations that attach to a community that we have, but the true force of that obligation you don't just get by summing the obligations of individuals. And that is a view that's in Plato, for example, and it's a view that some philosophers and political theorists like to talk about, but I think it's very important to recognize that part of why that view has not been influential in moral and political philosophy, say post-Hegel, is because it's a profoundly illiberal view. I mean, it leads to profoundly illiberal places. And the spectrum of most moral and political thought in the United States and Europe, whether of the right or the left, is within this broadly liberal tradition. And again, it's very easy to think about this as a kind of conceptual, theoretical solution to a particular sort of problem. But actually, and especially academics, of a certain stripe, love to bash liberalism. But in fact, there's an enormous amount about human flourishing and achievement and many, many things that we value that are actually connected to this much more strongly individualist outlook. So that is a direction. It's one that people are exploring, but it is important to explore it in full recognition of the costs that are implied. And in the early days, in the 60s, people used to talk about this sometimes in a much cruder way of just saying things like, can democracy and liberalism survive the environmental crisis? And a lot of us would like to think the answer is yes. Why don't you call on people, because otherwise I get some.
Yeah, so thank you for your talk. And I have one question that would go sort of towards the academic field and another maybe towards its implications for larger society. And you bring us up to a certain point, but I'm curious to your reflection on newer branches of environmental ethics, like pragmatism. You begin with the problem and then you bring the stakeholders together and so on, which are represented by a variety of people. So I'd love to sort of hear your take on that and its efficacy. But actually, even more importantly, maybe, because you've been involved in this for a long, long time, it strikes me as there's incredibly good minds working on this. Yours among them, and for a very long time, and remarkable publications and journals and conferences and so on. But I wonder, where's the traction, and where's the, not only in academia, but are these arguments able to reach a larger public? I guess would be my question, and your reflection.
Okay, so these aren't going to be very satisfying. This isn't a very satisfying answer. The first thing to say is, it's generally the case in philosophy. What's seen as new is usually not new, as Henry actually demonstrated. And this pragmatic turn, I think, is intrinsic to virtually all American philosophy. There's a sense in which when American philosophers do anything, they do it with a pragmatist sensibility that you don't get in the philosophy that goes on in the continent, for example. So that's all I'll say about the first question. About the second question, there are two ways of gaining traction. So one way of gaining traction is to write stuff that actually makes a difference in the world. I think a lot of academics feel, at least of my generation, feel a bit lost because we used to think that meant you write a popular book, and now we're living in a world in which people basically are glued to social media. And so a lot of us don't really know exactly what it means anymore to have traction in the wider world. Some younger people do, I think. And when it comes to traction in universities, it boils down in a way to a very simple thing. I mean, if I have a student who wants to write about extinction, or wants to write about the varieties of Kantian constructivism and metaethics, I'll tell them to write about the second thing, because they're much more likely to get a job and be able to keep doing this kind of work. And that's the issue that goes on in universities. And we can pretend it doesn't exist, but it's a real thing in terms of I teach in the law school at NYU. It's the same problem. We have these incredibly great students who want to practice environmental law. There are very few jobs for low-paying public interest environmental law lawyers. There are many more jobs for high-paying environmental law corporate people, but even more jobs for people who want to do securities and financial instruments. These are real things.
Sorry, really quick. You said the first is a natural tendency of American philosophy to go pragmatic, but you didn't give us your sense of there's a whole new generation of ethicists, and are they making any better headway? What's your view?
Do you mean of people doing environmental ethics?
Yeah, pragmatic.
Yeah, no, I don't, let's just say no. Which doesn't mean that there aren't good young people in the field. There certainly are. But what I was trying to say is there's no such thing as this environmental pragmatism movement. It's essentially a label without any real content, in my opinion.
Go ahead, Bob.
This is a question and not a comment, really. You lost me at one point where you took the answer no for required a good ethic because an environmental ethic didn't make other ethics drop dead. Do you need to conquer all to be useful as a player?
No.
So what were you saying there that I didn't get?
Yeah, I think it's just a matter of reminding you of a historical moment, or at least one that I was embedded in, that, okay. So I would say in the 60s and the 70s, there was often this sensibility around the environmental movement, which still exists to some degree, that there's no amount of the kinds of considerations that some people would give about why we should do something that could ever really count against some set of environmental reasons or commitments. I mean, the classic case is John Muir, right? When he talks about the desecration of Yosemite Valley. He doesn't care how many acre-feet of water will get to San Francisco, or how much, GDP or economic development will be produced, as a result of that. This is just supposed to be a trumping value. And I think this search for a trumping environmental value has been a sort of animating concern in the environmental movement that I think kind of pooped out sometime in the last 10 years, 20 years, whatever, But that period I'm talking about, the 60s and 70s and the formation of the field, that was still, I think, a strong motivator.
Thank you. Just a question on your ethical structure here, this tree that has grown of different various questions with now many different branches and twigs. Dale, do you have a feeling that the bottom of that tree, the first seed, is the question of anthropocentrism, that basic attitude that all natural systems, indeed all matter, is here for human use and benefit, and that essentially is the beginning question that any ethical discussion about the environment has to focus on first?
Okay, good question. I think one of the things that's plagued the field of environmental ethics that I hope has finally been straightened out has been a confusion about what I would call, excuse me, the source of values and the content of values. And so when people say, for example, we must protect this forest for its own sake, it was natural for some people to think, like Holmes Ralston, for example, that meant that even if there weren't any valuers around, that the forest would still be of value. And so some people thought it was very important to dig in their heels on that point and say, no, values are non-anthropocentric, they're completely independent of humanity and so on and so forth. Now, but it's really kind of hard for many of us to be non-anthropocentrists in that sense. I mean, if I imagine a lifeless, insentient universe, values seem to escape from that universe. But there's another sense in which non-anthropocentric values are very familiar to us. So, for example, we go to enormous costs to protect and preserve works of art. And if somebody, buys a wonderful painting and you say, why did you buy that painting? And he says, well, because I had a hole in the wall here and I was looking for something to patch it, right? We're sort of horrified because that's misunderstanding the way that you value this artwork. And sometimes we think the value of artworks is so powerful that it can really overwhelm a lot of interest that people have. So in World War II, for example, Churchill actually diverted enormous resources to evacuating the museums of London that could have been devoted to actually evacuating people. So what I want to say when it comes to the content of our values, the idea that we think that nature or art is valuable in one sense, just in itself, is a very familiar notion. So non-anthropocentrism in that sense, I want to say, is not even a new idea. It's just reminding us that it is one of the ways that we value things normally. But it's gotten confused with non-anthropocentrism in this other sense of thinking that the value of nature has to be in some way transcendent and beyond the existence of any valuers, and seeing that as the price for admission to environmentalism or having an environmental ethic, I think has confused the discussion.
So Muir had it both ways, that when he imputed a spiritual value to nature, you're saying,
Right.
But also argued that nature has its own independent value outside of humanity. Is that
Right, exactly.
way to look at it?
He was the original confuser in a sense. And if you believe, and for example, if you're a theist and you have that view that maybe Muir did, at least he did in some places, then it's easy to see how the two things go together, because the forest will still have value even if no humans are around, but that's because there's still a valuer. The valuer now is God. So is that non-anthropocentric? Well, yes, but it's not really, it's still theocentric in some way, right? So if you have that view, it's easy to see how the source and the content of values can seem to come together, because value doesn't ultimately depend on people, because it depends on God. So
I think we have time for one more question. We'll have to take a few minutes to carry the mic over.
management versus moral approach. And I see that dichotomy on a daily basis, where as an institution, we want to embody a moral ethic about what the right thing to do is. And yet, we have to look at it through the lens, a lens that is very management focused. So I'm curious about what your thoughts are, how we can effectively move through that. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid that my response in this respect, as in others, will be highly underwhelming. And I mean, I guess all I can say are two things, right? I mean, one thing is that management always has to be in the service of some values that are exogenous to the management. That's really important because sometimes management just can take on a life of its own, right? And so it's important to do what one can to keep that from happening. On the other side of it, of the coin, is this love of symbology that we have as Americans often can come from sort of overly moralizing issues, right? And people can lose sight of the fact that what we should think really matters is, say, the reduction of this bad, rather than I don't participate in this bad, even if it should produce a reduction. So I think it's a little bit one of those things where there's dangers to the left of you, dangers to the right of you. No philosopher can give you advice, but I'm sure you're doing a great job from what I hear. So.
Okay, thank you, Dale Jamieson.